I'm often asked, following performances, especially by musicians, how I have found the melody to Bewlf, how I have found the musical notation, where does the score come from? And that's a very difficult question to answer, but it's also a simple one to answer. The simple answer is that there is no score to Bewlf, there's no music, and there is no melody. And it's not because that melody once existed and was written down and then lost. It's because that melody never existed in the first place. There is no musical documentation from Anglo-Saxon times. There are no manuscripts containing musical notation. There are no scores of any kind. In fact, there's no notation whatsoever for European music from before the 9th century. However, we do know that music was sung, that a poem such as Bewlf was told with music, with harp accompaniment, with a singer, and it's our job to reconstruct that performance based on what information we can find from that time. If there's no melody, what are the tones that I'm singing when I am singing? And how did I go about finding them? Where did they come from? This is the long answer to the question, and it involves a reconstruction process that began many years ago when I first became interested in the idea of reconstructing Anglo-Saxon performed oral poetry. When I got in contact with a harp builder who was commissioned by a museum to make reconstructions of instruments which were found in fragmentary form from excavations, from archaeological excavations dating from the 7th or 6th centuries in Northern Europe. And one of these excavations in Germany yielded 2 instruments which could be reconstructed. They date clearly from the time of the Bewlf poem's life as an oral poem, and the harp builder made the reconstructions exactly according to the fragments which were discovered and exactly according to the type of wood, the size, the design, everything that he could learn based on research of the artifacts led to the reconstruction of an instrument. And that's the instrument I'm using in this performance. It looks like this, and it's made of oak. It has strings made of sheep gut, which are twisted and stretched, and sheep gut is a very common string material throughout the Middle Ages and indeed well into the 19th century. And although it looks like a very thin, solid plank of wood, it's hollow inside. So for instance, if I tap on it, you hear that it's a hollow plank of wood. It has no holes, however. There are no sound holes, nowhere to let the sound escape. It's kept within this closed box. And that's the way these instruments were constructed. The bridge, which is made of bone, sits directly on top of the resonating box and is actually freestanding. It's held in place by the pressure of the strings themselves and transmits the sound of the plucked string into the wood so that the whole instrument vibrates when it's played. That's the easy part. The difficult part of this reconstruction is to decide how to tune these strings. And that's a musical process that involves a little bit playing question and answer, talking about what kinds of tones would have been known in that culture at that time, and what kinds of tones are possible on an instrument of this size with the technology of making sheep gut strings that would have been known in the 7th or 8th century. And that leads to certain decisions being made in advance. For instance, a sheep gut string that is this length cannot produce a tone below a certain pitch. This one is really the lowest possible pitch on such an instrument of such a size. You can't have a low bass tone such as you would find in a modern harp or a cello or any other bass instrument on an instrument of this size. That sets the bottom pitch limit of the gut string. And then with smaller strings, with thinner strings, also made of gut, you have to see, well, we have the same length string. All 6 strings are the same length. And if you have a thinner string and it's stretched really almost to the breaking point, what's the highest pitch that you can get? And basically that highest pitch is an octave above the lowest one. So if this is the lowest pitch, then I have the highest pitch. And that more or less sets the outer limits of my tuning system. It doesn't have to be an octave, but that is a good place to begin because the octave is a very consonant interval in all musical cultures of the world. And it certainly is a very logical place to start if you have the highest and lowest possible tones. And then we have 4 other strings that need to be tuned somehow in relation to that highest and lowest pitch. Clearly there are 2 ways to go about doing this. One is just to make a scale of 6 tones, starting with the lowest tone and going up 6 steps. That's one kind of tuning which is possible, and there is some documentation for it from the Middle Ages. But the tuning I have decided to use is based on this octave idea. And so by filling in the other 4 strings, there will be some tones missing, which is why this instrument sounds to our ears pentatonic. It has certain tones missing. And it's tuned by looking at the consonant intervals that would have been known to all medieval musicians, or Roman musicians for that matter, or Greek musicians. And those are the consonant intervals, the perfect 5th, the perfect 4th, and they're tuned from the lowest string up, which yields this perfect 5th, and from the highest string down, which yields this perfect 5th, and automatically we get the perfect 4ths that result. So we have 2 perfect 4ths, 2 perfect 5ths, and then the only thing left to tune are strings 2 and 5. And these can be tuned one way or another depending on the musical mode that I have decided to use. And in this particular mode, they yield another perfect 5th, which is kind of an alternative to the other 2. Here are the 2 major 5ths, this one and this one. So we have major interval, another important interval, and a secondary one. And that's all 6 tones. Now, when I'm playing, I clearly have to play principally with my right hand because I'm holding the instrument with the left hand. The thumb is free to play a bit on the top 2 strings. That's a kind of technique, like in certain instruments you have drone strings, which are repeated very often. They thicken the texture, and that's really the function of the left hand. The right hand is doing all the playing. The hand is playing patterns. It's playing repeating, inverted patterns, different kinds of figurations, which create speed, density, give the impression of time passing or of time stopping. The way notes are played together or in sequence can create colors in rhythm and in tone, and can also function in certain parts of the musical mode to create even a shift in feeling. That's what the right hand is doing principally, while the left hand is kind of playing 2 strings to create a thickening of the texture or an increase of speed, and it yields to all kinds of different possibilities. These are the patterns that you would hear in my performance. It's stressing certain intervals, and it's associated with a certain idea, a certain activity, or even a certain character. And in this case, I've had to work over a long period of time to figure that out. I didn't work it out on paper beforehand. Everything I do musically with this text is based uniquely on the text and on my working with it. I don't have any musical score for my work. There is no document I can refer to. I don't have any notes or any music paper even. I never made any sketches. It's all happening in hand memory, which is linked to text memory. And so I'm trying to, in a way, recreate that lost oral tradition by saying, here's the text, it has a certain metrical structure, which is quite subtle, but very strong, and that text in that structure, in combination with the 6 tones of this instrument, and the patterns that the hand can play, as determined by the character, the time, the action, all of those different facets of the Bewlf story, which is so beautifully crafted. All of these things, the metrics of the text, the sounds of the words, the tones of the instrument and the 6 tones that it gives me, the patterns that the hand play, they all combine to form a quite complex matrix, which I use. It serves me during the performance to create new feelings, to create memory during the performance, that we hear something again that we heard long ago that reminds us of something. And of course the instrument, which is louder in my ear than it is in the audience's ear, is kind of serving me as a companion and giving me inspiration, giving me support, and certainly giving me musical tones to work with during the performance. So there's a complex web of things going on in any given performance of Bewlf that I might do. No two performances are the same. They're very similar, but they're never exactly the same. There are some set pieces in the story which have a very clearly delineated beginning and ending, and in those set pieces I more or less play the same things or sing the same things every time. But there are other connecting materials or pieces that are leading up to something that's set, which are quite free, and I might vary them from performance to performance, even quite radically, depending on the room I'm in, the audience that's in front of me, what I had for dinner, how I'm feeling, the weather. All of those factors may come into play to determine what I actually sing, how long the notes are, how short the notes are, whether I speak or whether I sing, whether I play a lot or play a little bit or don't play at all. So clearly there's a very living thing going on there. And it has to replace the fact that I didn't learn this poem from a teacher who taught me by saying, this is the way it's done, only like this, you must do it this way every time. That's the tradition. It's what's expected of you, it's what my father expected of me, and you will carry it on. I don't come from that tradition because it doesn't exist anymore, and so I have to create it for myself. It will then die with me, and someone else will come along and recreate it again, probably. But that's the nature of this kind of work. It's intangible, and it's always being created new every time and in every performance.